The Battle for Moscow Chapter 2. The worries virtually won. Just after 3 o'clock, at dawn on the fine Sunday morning of June 22, 1941, German troops crossed the frontier from the Baltic coast, in the north, to the Carpathians near the Hungarian frontier, in the south. They gained tactical surprise nearly everywhere. Von Bock's army group center with a force of 50 divisions, 9 of which were panzer and 6 motorized, supported by Field Marshal Kesselring's 2 air fleet, had to advance rapidly on Smolensk in order to destroy the opposing enemy West Front, the Russian designation of an army group, which was centered on Belorussia. 1 Von Bock's plan was based on a deep double envelopment directed on Minsk, about 170 miles in the Red Army rear, to be made by 2 panzer groups, Colonel General Hoth's from the southeast tip of East Prussia to the north of what was called the Białystok salient, and Colonel General Guderian's to the south of the salient from the area of Brest-Litovsk. A shorter double envelopment was to be made inside the armored pincers by Colonel General Strauss's 9 Army in the north and Field Marshal von Kluge's 4 Army in the south, encircling those Soviet troops forward in the Białystok salient. Only when the encircled Soviet formations had been destroyed was it planned to resume the advance for yet another 150 miles to the east as far as the Dnieper. Hoth and Guderian swinging out again in wide arcs, one to the north and one to the south, in order to meet once more, this time near Smolensk. Von Bock and his 2 panzer group commanders had disagreed with the main operative objective given to them by the OKH, and considered that the first envelopment should have been directed on Smolensk and not Minsk. Long drawn-out arguments had taken place in the period between March and June. Hitler was opposed to the deep Smolensk envelopment because he considered, probably rightly, that the marching infantry formations, which made up more than 75% of the German forces, would be left too far behind and would be unable to support the strung-out panzer and motorized divisions in holding and destroying the encircled Soviet troops. But no clear and binding decision had been given, even as an echo of his master, by von Brauchitsch, who had become a shuttlecock between the Führer and von Bock. So it came about that after the first 48 hours of war von Bock, Hoth and Guderian were not entirely sure whether to close on Minsk or whether they would be permitted to go straight to the Dnieper. 2. Personal diaries at this time reveal how effectively Hitler's basic order No I had come to be applied over the previous 15 months, showing that German commanders were already displaying a remarkable ignorance as to developments in other theaters and sectors, sometimes even on their flanks, and they appear to have had but little understanding of the mechanics, the involved personal relationships and the source of the real power within the Army High Command, OKH. This not unnaturally resulted in confusion, and too often commanders were to lay the blame on their immediate seniors in the chain of command. 3. The only senior staff officer within the Armed Forces High Command, OKW, who had any influence with the Führer, limited indeed though it was of course Jodl, but since Jodl had no responsibility for German army matters on the Eastern Front, von Brauchitsch and Halder tended to consider him as an interloper, and they deliberately excluded him from army planning. Within the OKH, the relationship between the Commander-in-Chief and the Chief of General Staff was cool. Von Bock, who was regarded by the OKH as being difficult and uncooperative, was, notwithstanding, on moderately good terms with Halder. There was, however, some antipathy between him and Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. Von Bock was the senior and the more experienced of the two and may possibly have considered that he had been superseded when Hitler had appointed von Brauchitsch to be Commander-in-Chief. But it is more likely that von Bock's intolerance was aggravated by von Brauchitz's apparent indecision, for the commander of Army Group Center does not seem to have realized, at least until late in the summer, the extent to which the German Army Commander-in-Chief was overshadowed by Hitler. He wrongly believed that the army plan for Barbarossa emanated from von Brauchitsch, not knowing that the Führer himself had laid down not only the general outline but also the execution. And so von Bock did not understand why von Brauchitsch could not be persuaded to alter, at von Bock's recommendation, operational, even tactical, details of the plan which had been imposed on Army Group Center, and he became increasingly impatient with what the war is virtually won. He regarded as the interference and the excessively close control exercised by the OKH. Von Bock, overbearing with both superiors and subordinates, was not, however, inhibited from severely restricting the freedom of his own army commanders, even to the extent of meddling with matters which were scarcely his concern. His relationship with the level-headed Hoth was satisfactory, but tension was to arise between von Bock and Strauss. He did not get on at all well with the energetic Field Marshal von Kluge, so well esteemed by Hitler, and he had very little time for the arrogant, impetuous, and undisciplined Guderian. Between Guderian and von Kluge there was bitter animosity, and among many of the senior generals of Army Group Center there was a distinct lack of discipline and loyalty. In spite of the many difficulties during the planning and preparatory phase, von Bock's success during the early stages of the overrunning of Belorussia was remarkable. The Belorussians, or White Russians, are not Russians. They did of course form part of the early Kievan Russian Empire in the 9th century, but from the 10th to the 18th century they were governed by both Lithuanian and Pole. The people of Belorussia numbered less than 10 million, of which nearly 3 million were Jews, and the White Russian was generally regarded by his Russian and Ukrainian cousin to be a rather low and mean-spirited fellow. The population was mainly rural and, even by the Russian standards of the time, was very poor and almost unbelievably primitive. The capital, Minsk, had about 250,000 inhabitants, but the other main cities, Gomel, Vitebsk, Mogilev, Bobruisk, Grodno, and Brest-Litovsk, Brest of the Lithuanians, had populations of only 40 to 100,000. It had little industry, no mineral resources except peat, and the agricultural land was infertile. To the German soldier, Belorussia was to conjure up a picture of the remains of primeval forests of oak, beech, and lime. About 1/3 of the whole area was still wooded, and the forests were thickest in the west near the old Polish frontier, vast potato fields covered with great rocks and boulders, pigs in profusion, innumerable dilapidated farmsteads and hamlets, and broad lakes with high rounded banks. And to the south of Belorussia were the Pripet marshes, slow meandering streams and creeks forming a great network of waterways. The swamps and surrounds were overgrown with dense rushes and an impenetrable tangle of aspen and alder. The humidity and mosquitoes added to the discomfort. On the morning of June 22 the Panzer Corps passed through the great 50-mile deep belts of forests near the frontier and emerged into the more open country in the hinterland. Except at the frontier posts, where some of the NKVD border troops put up a most fanatical fight, the resistance of the Soviet West Front was in general neither determined nor protracted. Kesselring's 2 air fleet had almost undisputed command of the skies, and the Red Air Force had shown that it was outmatched by Luftwaffe skill and equipment. Losses, particularly in aircraft destroyed on the ground, had been very heavy. The air situation, as had formerly been the case in Poland and in France, was decisive to the outcome of the land battle. Much of the credit for the success was due to Kesselring, a former artillery officer transferred to the Luftwaffe, a born optimist whose ready grin earned him the nickname of Smiling Al. Kesselring was one of the few officers who could work with von Bock without friction, and to this more than anything else was probably due the excellent German Army and Luftwaffe cooperation. The Soviet West Front, its control and communications organization gone, lay paralyzed and inert, waiting to be hewn to pieces. Too rarely at this time did the Red Army troops in Belorussia show that heroism since attributed to them by communist propaganda. Resistance was uneven, in places it was bitter, but for the most part the Soviet forces surrendered or ran off into the woods. Yet, Only 3 days after the start of the war, the Führer, in a fit of nerves, bypassed von Brauchitsch and suggested to von Bock that the Minsk panzer envelopment should be abandoned in favor of a much shorter one. This proposal von Bock resisted with all the arguments at his command. 4. Within a week of the start of the war, Hoth and Guderian closed in on the important rail junction of Minsk, the sprawling capital of Belorussia on the Warsaw-Moscow highway, which stood in great fields of knee-high wheat and barley. When they joined forces near the city, the greater part of 3 Soviet armies, nearly the whole of West Front, had been surrounded. Although many of the encircled troops escaped eastwards using the cover of the woods and of darkness, by July 3 290,000 prisoners, including several corps and divisional commanders, had gone into the prisoner of war cages. It was claimed that no less than 2,500 Soviet tanks were knocked out or captured. 5. On this day Halder, the Chief of General Staff, wrote in his diary that it was probably not too much to say that the war against Russia, which he referred to as a campaign, Feldzug, had been virtually won within 14 days. 6. On June 26, by Hitler's express order and against von Bock's wishes, 2 and 3 panzer groups were removed from von Bock's direct control and put under von Kluge's command, ready for the second phase of the battle and the resumption of the eastwards march towards Smolensk and Moscow. 7. Guderian, not without malice, was subsequently to hint that the army group commander, tired of Führer control, was ridding himself of the direct responsibility for the coordination of the advance, yet it is probable that Guderian, who like von Bock was a difficult man with both superiors and subordinates, felt some pique in not being given the new command, for which his name had in fact been put forward but had been vetoed by Halder. So the new panzer command was given to the 58-year-old von Kluge, an able and active field commander, who was, however, an artillery officer without panzer experience. Von Kluge was transferred, together with his 4 army headquarters, to take direct command over Hoth's and Guderian's panzer groups, each of 2 or 3 corps the size of a small army, and von Kluge's new command was given the temporary and unofficial designation of 4 Panzer Army. Meanwhile, von Kluge's infantry corps were taken over by a new army headquarters activated from the reserve, Colonel General Freiherr von Wax's 2 Army. The advance began towards Smolensk, but von Kluge's handling of armor found little favor with the hypercritical Guderian. Yet much the same view was taken by Hoth, a steadier and more objective character than Guderian, who was known affectionately to his staffs as Papa Hoth. Hoth, although by arm an infantry officer, was one of the most experienced tank generals of the time. 8. One of the 5 Panzer Corps had been directed away from the main axis northeastwards towards Polotsk and Veliki Luki, once again at the order of the Führer, and the other 4 advanced in line on a very broad front without Schwerpunkt or reserve. Guderian, obsessed with his open southern flank, constantly extended to his right. Heavy summer rain began to fall, turning the roads and tracks into quagmires and bringing wheeled movement to a halt. The success of the German infantry formations at this time was measured more by stamina and marching ability than by skill in fighting. In heat and dust, and sometimes knee-deep in mud, they marched rapidly eastwards in the wake of the Panzer Corps, as is the case with dismounted infantry the world over. Every yard of the advance was made by the men's own effort, most of their personal belongings being on their backs. 20 to 30 miles were covered each day, and every day, the men, unlike the horses which were resentful at the loss of the weekly rest day, were becoming harder and fitter as the weeks went by. 9 There was little or no time for bathing or washing, and there was little water to be had. Clothing became filthy, and vermin, so dear to Mother Russia, had begun to appear. Yet morale had never been higher. The tank troops, however, saw the war somewhat differently, for their lives and effectiveness were linked to their vehicles. When Schmundt, Hitler's military aide and his roving eyes and ears, appeared at 3 Panzer Group headquarters near the city of Vitebsk on July 13. Hoth told him that tank casualties had not been heavy and were in no way more severe than those suffered in France, but that the terrain and climate were proving far more wearing on vehicles and on men than had been expected. Mechanical casualties were high. The monotony of the landscape, the somber woods and the flatness of the plains had a very depressing effect on the German tank troops. 10 The bitterness and barbarity of the Red Army, too, had come as a shock. German prisoners in Soviet hands had been cruelly put to death. Because of the large numbers of armed Red Army men who had taken refuge in the woods, it was usually unsafe to leave the German bivouac areas. Smolensk, at the head of the navigable Dnieper, although once ethnically white Russian, lay beyond the political borders of Belorussia in dairy farming country and fields of corn and flax, studded with woodlands and orchards. An ancient city with a Kremlin and fortress walls, it had long been fought over by Russian and Pole, but, unlike Vitebsk which was already in flames, on this occasion it was to be spared, for Hoth and Guderian closed in, on July 16, on Yartsevo, a cotton milling town just to the northeast of Smolensk on the Smolensk-Moscow Railway. A huge pocket of Red Army troops stretching over 70 miles from Orsha to Smolensk was almost surrounded. The German panzer formations were too extended and the infantry divisions too far in the rear, however, to seal off the whole of the cauldron, and many of the encircled troops escaped. On July 25 an angry and excited Hitler telephoned to von Bock demanding to know why the cauldron had not been closed, and von Bock told the Führer as much as it was good for him to know. Keitel arrived the next day to emphasize his master's displeasure. Meanwhile, the petulant Guderian, censured by von Bock, was demanding to be removed from his appointment. 11. By the time that the marching infantry divisions began to arrive, the end was not far off for the great seething mass of men and vehicles stretching as far as the eye could see along the Moscow highway. By August 5 all resistance inside the pocket had ceased, and a further 300,000 prisoners and 3,000 tanks, intact or knocked out, fell into German hands. 12 Smolensk was about 400 miles as the crow files from Brest-Litovsk, Guderian's start line, and 200 miles from Moscow. Guderian and Hoth had arrived beyond Smolensk on July 16, just over 3 weeks after the start of the war. In the other two theaters German progress had, in the main, been very satisfactory. Field Marshal von Lieb had attacked from East Prussia into the Baltic states, but, although he had seized the crossing places over the Dwina, he had been unable to prevent the Soviet Northwest Front from withdrawing rapidly northeastwards. Nor was von Lieb more successful in his efforts to envelop the enemy before he could withdraw into Russia, for the Soviet High Command showed little of the expected determination to hold on to the Baltic states. Soviet losses in equipment of all types were heavy, these including aircraft, tanks, vehicles, ships, and naval vessels, but in personnel they were very fight. Comparatively few Red Army prisoners were taken by Army Group North. Towards the end of July, however, when von Lieb was nearing Leningrad and the German formations, strung out over a distance of 400 miles, were finding movement difficult in the close country, Red Army resistance began to stiffen most noticeably. In the Ukraine the conditions of battle and terrain varied yet again. The Soviet Southwest and South fronts were jointly much stronger than the Northwest Front in the Baltic states and the West Front in Belorussia, and the Southwest Front in particular proved more alert and ready for action. Field Marshal von Rundstedt made progress, however, to the south of the Pripyat marshes in spite of resistance which in places was fanatical, the Soviet troops making good use of the marshlands and the broken and wooded country in their defense. On June 30, 11 German army in Romania crossed the Pruth and, together with 2 Romanian armies, began a steady advance through Bessarabia into the Ukraine. On August 8 came von Rundstedt's only notable success, the surrounding of about 20 divisions of South Front near Uman when 103,000 prisoners were taken, including 2 Army and 7 Corps commanders. 13 Meanwhile, von Rundstedt was being heavily pressed by a buildup of Red Army troops on his far left flank, on the inter-army group boundary between himself and von Bock, along the southern skirts of the Pripet marshes in the area to the north of Korosten and Kiev. In spite of some failures, the German army in the east had carried out the greater part of its mission. Army Group Center had crossed the Dnieper and destroyed West Front. Army Group North had passed over the Dwina and had cleared most of the Baltic states, advancing almost as far as Leningrad. It had not, however, taken the city, destroyed Northwest Front or joined up with the Finns. Army Group South had probably had the least success since it had only just reached the area of the Dnieper and, in spite of the encirclement at Uman, had not destroyed the southwest and south fronts which were still fighting strongly in fairly good order. The Führer had next to decide on the second phase of his strategy and the German army in the east awaited his further orders. Army Group Center headquarters had established itself on the banks of the Berzina at Borisov, a town northeast of Minsk on the main trunk route, not far from the spot where Napoleon had crossed the river in 1812 on his way to Moscow. On August 4, when Hitler visited Army Group Center to discuss strategic aims, von Bock was forced to the conclusion that the Führer himself just did not know what to do next. Von Bock had told him that Army Group Center could be in Moscow by the end of August, but Hitler, to von Bock's surprise and consternation, appeared to be little interested in a resumption of the advance eastwards. 14. Hitler would talk continually around a difficult subject for weeks before he made up his mind, but as soon as he had taken a decision there was an end to the matter and none could shift him. Then would start another round of seemingly interminable arguments between himself, his staff and his commanders. In early July he had been stressing the economic importance of the area of the Baltic and the Ukraine, and he had come to believe that the Crimea could be used as a Soviet aircraft carrier to bomb the German source of Romanian oil at Plosti. For this reason, he thought, the Crimea must be taken. The Crimea would be useful, too, as a stepping stone across the Straits of Kerch in the Caucasus. In fact, Hitler was determined to adhere to the Jodl strategy of the previous autumn. In the second half of July, immediately after Hoth and Guderian had closed on Smolensk, the Führer confirmed his previous ideas and ordered the removal of Hoth's panzer troops to the area of Leningrad while Guderian's panzer group was to be switched southwards to destroy the flanking Red Army build-up in the area of Korosten and Kiev. Von Bock, he said, could advance the 200 miles to Moscow using only his infantry formation. Hoth would be returned to Army Group Center, after the taking of Leningrad, in order to help von Bock on beyond Moscow eastwards to the Middle Volga. So optimistic was the Führer in these early days that he was planning to recall Hoepner's panzer group, with von Leeb, back to Germany for garrison duties. 15. At this point arose the violent argument as to whether or not Moscow should be taken before Leningrad and the Ukraine. This was to split the high command and cause the rupture which eventually led to the dismissal of von Brauchitsch, Halder, and to a lesser extent von Brauchitsch, had always considered that Moscow must be taken as a first priority, and had unsuccessfully pressed this course of action in the previous December. Hitler said he was convinced that Leningrad and the Ukraine were priorities and that Moscow was of no importance, being merely a mark on a map. For a whole month, until August 24, the arguments continued, with Hitler on the one side and von Brauchitsch, Halder, von Bock, von Rundstedt, Guderian, and Hoth on the other. Even Jodl had now changed his mind and considered that the main thrust should be continued on Moscow, and he went so far as to undertake to use his influence to try and persuade the dictator to this end, dryly adding, however, that to make the Führer change his mind was going to be a very difficult task. 16 So it turned out. Guderian protested to von Bock that his panzer group was tired and understrength and so near crippled by mechanical wear and tear that he doubted whether it could make the long march to the south and still remain effective. These were the arguments which von Bock and Halder wanted to hear. Guderian, who was on good terms with Hitler, was dispatched to the Führer's East Prussian general headquarters in Rassenburg to press his views. But Guderian's efforts were hampered, so he subsequently said, by a tired and dispirited von Brauchitsch, who had just been bitterly reproached by the Führer for weakness, being too much influenced by the views of the army group commanders. Von Brauchitsch told Guderian, as soon as he arrived in East Prussia, that the Führer had already decided the matter and that it was no use bleeding against it. This cut much of the ground from under Guderian's feet, and yet he appears to have made only a feeble effort to dissuade Hitler, an attempt that was in the event singularly unsuccessful, because the panzer leader came away having been himself convinced by the wily and plausible Führer of the correctness of the dictator's views. Hitler's other supporters appear to have been those advisers without responsibility, Keitel and Schmundt.17. So it came about that when, in the height of summer, German troops were only 200 miles from Moscow, Hoth was sent 400 miles to the north while Guderian went the same distance to the south. As a concession, Hitler agreed that von Bock should rest his troops in the area of Smolensk until his panzer formations should be returned to him. Stalin had always shown a close and personal interest in military affairs and, as Secretary General of the Communist Party, had controlled the armed forces, according to Trotsky, through the pliant Marshal Voroshilov. Voroshilov, until May 1940 the Soviet Minister for Defense, had in fact some organizing ability even though he was without real military experience or training. Following the Red Army defeats in the 1939–40 Finnish Winter War, Stalin removed Voroshilov from his appointment, replacing him by a professional soldier, Marshal Timoshenko, a 45-year-old cavalryman, formerly the commander of Kiev Military District. About 3 months later, in September of that year, there was a change of chiefs of general staff. The 57-year-old Marshal Shapashnikov, who had been a regular officer of the Imperial Tsarist General Staff and was a colonel at the time of the First World War, being in indifferent health made way for a much younger man, the 43-year-old General Merezhkov, an officer of a very different background. For Merezhkov, once a politically active Moscow factory worker, had entered the Red Army in 1918 as a political commissar and remained with the Corps of Commissars for 12 years. Advancement, this time as a military commander, had come rapidly following a short period of combat service in Spain and a year's tour of duty as Deputy Chief of General Staff. Shapashnikov, an academician and author of a number of learned works, who was regarded widely as being the father of the General Staff, was re-employed as a Deputy Minister for Defense responsible for the fortifications in western Russia. The gentle and dignified Shapashnikov was much valued by Stalin as a staff officer and planner, and the dictator was loath to lose him. In December 1940 Timoshenko, who was an outstanding trainer of staffs and troops, held a series of presentations and lectures in Moscow, attended by all high-ranking Soviet officers in command and on the staff. This meeting was concluded by 2 elaborate war games covering a possible invasion of Belorussia and the Ukraine by German troops. The task of invading the Ukraine was given to General Pavlov, the commander of the West Front in Belorussia, while General Zhukov, the commander of Kiev Military District, was responsible for its defense. For the invasion of Belorussia the 2 commanders exchanged their roles, Pavlov defending his own home ground of Belorussia, while Zhukov acted as the commander of the attacking German forces. The war games were conducted and umpired by Merezhkov under Timoshenko's chairmanship. For this particular map exercise Zhukov was allowed 60 German divisions to overcome the resistance of Pavlov's force of 50 Red Army formations. The final summing up and post-mortem on the two games took place in the Kremlin in the presence of Stalin and the Politburo. The recapitulation and assessment, like the war games they followed, were most confusing. Merezhkov had had insufficient time to prepare his material and, under a barrage of searching questions from Stalin, became rattled and started to go to pieces. Stalin wanted to know which side had won and the reasons, and he was not deterred by Merezhkov's long and involved explanations as to relative strengths. "For," said Stalin, "statements that one Red Army division can rout a German division in an approach to contact is all very well for the propaganda claptrap printed in field regulations, but here we want to know the truth." Pavlov fared no better than Merezhkov. Pavlov, a 47-year-old, probably rather loud-mouthed and blustering cavalryman, who owed his position to his recent experience as a tank commander on the Ebro in Spain, tried in vain to laugh off some of Stalin's probes. Disconcerted, Pavlov then rounded with some heat on Zhukov, who had criticized the deployment of so many of Pavlov's formations forward in the Białystok salient. Voroshilov had to put an end to their bickering by pointing out that the responsibility for the sighting of defense lines, and for their development, rested with Moscow and Shapashnikov, the Deputy Minister for Defense and Fortifications. Worse was yet to come, for the bête noire, the enfant terrible, of the Soviet High Command, Marshal Kulik, then took the floor. A 50-year-old artilleryman, a notorious ignoramus who headed the main artillery administration where he was responsible for many aspects of weapon development, he spoke out in favor of the horse. He was against the use of massed tanks and against further mechanization. More money should be spent, he thought, on the development of horse-drawn artillery. These views caused a wag among the listeners to comment, sotto voce, that every Kulik Russian for a snipe prefers its own swamp. Kulik's presentation was more than Stalin could stand and the meeting broke up in disorder. All of those present were disillusioned with Kulik's performance, and many were sorry for Merezhkov and the General Staff. Shapashnikov, the elder statesman of the General Staff, so our informant Kozakov tells us, took this fiasco very hard. As the crowd of high-ranking officers collected their papers and moved away, he remained seated, lost in gloom, glancing from time to time at the members of the Politburo. Only the sad expression in his big intelligent eyes and the faint twitching of his large elongated head showed the old man's emotion. That day Stalin removed Merezhkov from his position as Chief of General Staff, replacing him by the commander of Kiev Military District, a very unwilling Zhukov. Zhukov, a 44-year-old cavalryman, had never served on the staff in his life. The German invasion caught Stalin entirely by surprise because, although he had been well aware of German war preparations and the movement of troops into Romania, East Prussia, and the German-occupied general government of Poland, neither he nor Lieutenant General Golikov, the head of the Intelligence Directorate of the Soviet General Staff, the GRU, could bring themselves to believe that Hitler would embark on a war on two fronts. Instead, Stalin viewed all intelligence suggesting the imminence of attack either as a British provocation or as a part of the nerve war which the Communists knew so well, at the worst presaging new German political or economic demands. Although no steps had been taken until too late on the night of June 21 to bring the Soviet armed forces to a state of war readiness, the Red Army was in fact better fitted for war than was generally realized at that time in Germany or elsewhere. In September 1939 the age limit for conscription had been lowered by 2 years and, because of this, 4 annual classes, totaling over 5 million men, were with the colors in 1941. As already recounted, the strength of the field army was 303 divisions, of which 75 were in the process of being mobilized from cadre form. 19 The total tank holdings stood at the surprisingly high figure of 24,000 and the Red Air Force fighter strength was stated to be 7,000 first-line aircraft. Except for the recently introduced T-34 and KV models, the quality of the tanks was, admittedly, not high and could hardly be compared with the German Mark III main battle tank, but many of the older heavy Soviet models could not be penetrated by the standard 37 mm German anti-tank gun. Red Air Force aircraft in 1941 were very much inferior to those of the Luftwaffe. Other Soviet equipment, however, particularly artillery and small arms, was of excellent quality, often superior to the German, and had been produced and stockpiled in great quantities. Many of the weaknesses at the time of the 1939–40 Finnish Winter War had been rectified. Some of the senior officers who had survived the purge but who still languished in prison or in concentration camp, among them Rokossovsky, had been hurriedly rehabilitated and returned to duty. There were 150 Red Army divisions on the western frontier between the Baltic and the Black Sea, with a further 20 divisions on the Finnish borders, and the field command was organized in very much the same fashion as that of the invading German troops. 21 Colonel General F.I. Kuznetsov's Northwest Front held the area of the Baltic states against von Leeb's Army Group North, while General Pavlov's West Front was based on Belorussia opposite von Bock's Army Group Center. To the south of the Pripet marshes, the Southwest Front, commanded by Zhukov's successor, Colonel General Kirponos, defended western Ukraine against von Rundstedt, while General Tyulina's South Front was in Bessarabia attempting to hold 11 German army and the Romanian forces. Timoshenko, the commander-in-chief, together with Zhukov, the chief of general staff, was in Moscow. All these senior commanders, except for Kirponos, were cavalrymen, and all were in their 40s. When the invasion was launched on June 22, Stalin, even in this 13th hour, tried to appease Germany in the vain hope that Hitler could be bought off. Then, according to the popular account circulated by his successors, he suffered a severe bout of nervous hysteria which gave way to deep apathy. If this did in fact occur, it must have been of relatively short duration, because, by 26 or June 27, Stalin was firmly back in the saddle. Beside himself with fury and worry, his first action was to remedy the truly disastrous situation of Pavlov's West Front in the only way he knew. Pavlov, who had spent most of the First World War as a non-commissioned officer and a prisoner of war in Germany, although possibly not an outstanding commander, was an experienced cavalry and tank commander. He had a total of 44 divisions, of which 12 were tank and 6 mechanized. Facing von Bock's 50 divisions, he was, however, as had been noted at the time of the Winter War game, badly deployed to meet an offensive, since all his armies were forward in the Białystok salient. In any case, he was allowed no freedom of maneuver, as all withdrawals had to be sanctioned by Moscow. The unfortunate Pavlov first became aware that his 3 armies had been surrounded from a radio conversation with Timoshenko, who had himself been informed of the encirclement by a monitor of the Berlin radio news. 3 of the 4 marshals of the Soviet Union, Voroshilov, Shapashnikov, and Kulik, were ordered by Stalin to report to the West Front to find out what was going on. Lieutenant General Eremenko, another cavalryman, who had just been flown from the Far East, reported to the West Front to take over command, this being the first intimation that the breakfasting Pavlov had that he was to be removed. The exhausted Pavlov's immediate reaction was one of resignation and relief at having shed his responsibilities, but within the hour he was arrested by the NKVD, together with Major General Klimovsky, his chief of staff, and his principal staff advisors. When Pavlov arrived in Moscow at the end of the month, he had so changed in appearance that Zhukov could hardly recognize him. Pavlov and several of his subordinates, including at least one army commander, were shot at Stalin's order, all of them being publicly condemned as traitors. Most military commanders trembled at the thought of another 1937 purge, while many of the Red Army rank and file began to suspect their higher commanders of being in German pay. In a matter of days Stalin had changed his mind once more. Eremenko, he thought, was hardly the man to save what was left of the West Front. Only Timoshenko could do that. So Timoshenko, the Bessarabian Ukrainian, whose reserved, polite and dignified exterior concealed the energetic and ruthless martinet underneath, was ordered to give up his appointments as Commander-in-Chief and Minister for Defense and take over the remnants of the West Front. The functions of the Commander-in-Chief were assumed by two committees, the National Defense Committee, or GKO, consisting of certain members of the Politburo who dealt with the wider aspects of political, economic, and military strategy, and the Stavka, which was a subordinate, mainly military, committee, the principal members of which were Timoshenko, Voroshilov, the commander of the Reserve Front Marshal Budany, Shapashnikov and Zhukov. Stalin was the chairman of both committees and was in effect Premier, Generalissimo, and Commander-in-Chief. Most of the armies of Budany's reserve front had been hastily moved westwards to defend the Moscow axis and came under the command of Timoshenko's West Front. Many of them were destroyed in the second of von Bock's great encirclements, that between Minsk and Smolensk. Budany, a former non-commissioned officer of Tsarist cavalry and an old crony of Stalin's from the days of the Civil War, a marshal with little military education or experience, was sent to the Ukraine at the beginning of July to take over the new Southwest Theater, formed from the combined Southwest and South fronts. Voroshilov, who was no more able than Budany, assumed command of the new Northwest Theater based on Leningrad, controlling the Leningrad, Northwest, and Karelian fronts, while Timoshenko's command was upgraded from a front to a theater, although it consisted in fact of only the amalgamated West and Reserve fronts. There were other postings of senior staff officers. Shapashnikov gave up his appointment of Deputy Minister for Defense, Fortifications, and was sent to buttress West Theater as Timoshenko's chief of staff, but since Shapashnikov was not in good health, he had to make way after a few weeks for Lieutenant General Sokolovsky, a man of proven staff ability, who had formerly been a Deputy Chief of General Staff and Chief of Staff of Moscow Military District. Now that Stalin had taken over Timoshenko's appointment, he was brought into direct and close contact with Zhukov. There is some evidence that the dictator was not too happy in these early days with his own choice of Chief of General Staff. Zhukov was a man of the people. Like Stalin, he was the son of a poor cobbler, but unlike him he was a Russian, from the Kaluga Oblast. As a youth he had been conscripted into the Tsarist Dragoons and had served with distinction as a cavalry non-commissioned officer in the Ukraine and Bessarabia, twice being decorated for bravery. After demobilization he rejoined the Red Army, still as a cavalryman, being rapidly promoted from squadron to regimental commander in 7th Cavalry Division, the commander of which was Rokossovsky. By the mid-1920s the Red Army had been reduced to 562,000 men, and the cavalry arm was a close and tightly knit circle. Everyone knew everyone else, and the cavalrymen who escaped the Great Purge were to become the principal field commanders during the Second World War. Among the group of cavalry officers so close to Zhukov at this time were Budany, Timoshenko, Tyelina, Rokossovsky, Sobennikov, Eremenko, Bagramian, Kostenko, Cherevakenko, Gorbatov, Muzichenko and Volsky. They were fellow students on the higher cavalry courses and followed each other in succession from appointment to appointment. By 1931, at the age of 35, Zhukov was commanding a division, and by 1937 a corps. 2 years later he was ordered to the Far East to command the forces engaged in border fighting against the Japanese, and, in May 1940, was nominated to command Kiev Military District. At the time of this appointment he was interviewed, for the first time, by Stalin. As a youth Zhukov had been a great reader, this in an age when a large proportion of the Russian peasantry was totally illiterate. His bookishness brought him to the attention of his sergeant major, old 4.5 fingers, who tried in vain to browbeat him into becoming the squadron clerk. Yet Zhukov was, and remained, without the discipline of a higher academic education. Although he attended many long senior officers' courses, he was neither staff-trained nor staff-qualified. Much of his later knowledge, he claimed, was acquired by the wide reading of military history, and the instruction of his cavalry arm guided his inclinations towards campaigns based on movement and the study of war at operational level. Stalin, probably for the first time, saw Zhukov for what he was, an outstanding field commander of cavalry and armor, but hardly a chief of general staff. It is possible that he began to compare Zhukov's qualities with those of the charming, pliant, and clever Shapashnikov, a man so liked and respected, even by the dictator, that everyone got on well with him. Zhukov began to displease the dictator, who merely rode roughshod over him. When Lieutenant General Krylev, the quartermaster general, was ordered by Stalin and Mikoyan to prepare a plan divorcing the ration and fuel supply and the medical services from the general staff, which had previously complained that it was unable to cope with these problems, the paper was handed by Stalin to Zhukov for comment. Zhukov, suddenly objecting to the diminishing of his responsibility, began to splutter and protest. In silence Stalin took back the paper, reached for his pen and, with a hard and meaningful look in Zhukov's direction, signed it. Not another word was said. The final break with Zhukov came only a few days later, at the end of July, when an angry Stalin, apparently displeased at Zhukov's suggestion that it might be necessary to evacuate Kiev, dismissed him, sending him first to command the reserve front and then, afterwards, to Leningrad, since the city appeared to be in danger of falling to von Leeb's forces. Shapashnikov returned once more to be Chief of General Staff, a post he held from the end of July 1941 to June 1942. For Shapashnikov was to Stalin what Jodl was to Hitler. Lieutenant General Vachetin, the Deputy Chief of General Staff, shared Zhukov's temporary eclipse and was sent to Northwest Front as Chief of Staff, the more important post of Deputy Chief of General Staff being given to Major General Vasilevsky, the Chief of the Operations Department, an officer who, in addition to becoming Chief of General Staff in 1942, was to undertake many command functions. Stalin himself had little military experience. He had escaped being conscripted into the Tsarist army in 1916 on the pretext that his arm was deformed and 2 toes grown together, and his only pretensions to military fame were based on his activities as a military commissar and political member of the military councils of the old revolutionary South and Southwest fronts, mainly at Tsaritsyn, Stalingrad, during the Civil War. There he had acted as Lenin's ears and eyes, the watchdog of the efficiency and political reliability of military commanders and staffs, and it was on the Volga that he had become acquainted with Voroshilov, Budany, Timoshenko and Tyelina. Although he was to ascribe to himself the success of the Tsaritsyn operations in the accounts written after he had destroyed his rivals and taken over the USSR as its dictator, he appears to have shown no evidence of great military ability but rather an overbearing determination to assert his will. Menace was never absent from Stalin's relationship and dealings with members of the Politburo and his military commanders and staffs, a number of whom had only just been rehabilitated from the terror and barbarity of the concentration camp. The evidence of Western observers at that time shows that Stalin's circle rarely dared to give an opinion before the dictator had spoken, and then it merely hastened to agree with him. Soviet descriptions of the dictator, as he was during the war years, are often contradictory and sometimes exaggerated. Although much of the bitterly anti-Stalinist speeches made by Khrushchev in 1956 can be discounted together with parts of the more recent Zhukov account, an account which was probably written at the bidding of the post-Khrushchev rulers of the Soviet Union in an attempt to rehabilitate Stalin, nearly all of the descriptions make the same telling points. 23. There can be no possible doubt that the overall direction of the war lay entirely in Stalin's hands. He alone was the commander-in-chief, and the General Staff and Ministry of Defense provided the organs through which Stalin prosecuted the military side of the war. The Stavka formed only an advisory council, and its decisions, which in reality were Stalin's decisions, were executed through the General Staff. Eventually a routine of work was evolved. Stalin rose shortly before noon to be briefed on battle developments during the past 12 hours, these reports having been telephoned to the Kremlin by the General Staff. At 5 in the afternoon he received a further telephone briefing. Late each night a General Staff delegation, headed by the Chief or Deputy Chief of General Staff, arrived at the Kremlin rooms which Stalin used as an office. There, in the arched-roofed, light oak-paneled gallery of the ancient fortress, under the massive oil portraits of the Tsarist generals Suvorov and Kutuzov, which, on the outbreak of war, Stalin had hung beside those of Marx and Lenin, the General Staff representatives, having brought their marked maps and more important documents with them, made their reports. The listening Stalin would pace up and down the room. At a long table against the opposite wall members of the GKO would be sitting, and members of the Stavka and the heads of the arms and main directorates, Voronov, Yakovlev, Fedorenko and Novikov might be in attendance in case technical questions were raised concerning their own arm. These meetings often continued until 3 or 4 in the morning. Throughout the whole of his working day Stalin was in touch with the front headquarters in the field by telephone or shortwave radio, operated by his own adjoining signal center and secretariat under his personal secretary, Poskrebyshev. Stalin demanded accurate, timely information and great exactitude in matters of detail. For the members of the General Staff in particular, working in close proximity to the dictator led to great mental and physical strain, for they were sometimes subjected to abuse and vilification and on occasion to summary punishment. Some broke down under the stress and never recovered. Yet all was forgiven Shapashnikov, who, tactful and kindly, tried to shield his own subordinates and the staffs of the fronts in the field. Often he willingly accepted blame which was not his due. And this was known to Stalin. Once, at the nightly briefing, it came to light that 2 of the fronts had not submitted to Moscow their evening battle situation reports. And that Shapashnikov had himself drafted the record, based on his own knowledge, which he had read out to the dictator. Stalin was not satisfied and he probed until the truth came out. He asked angrily, "And have you punished those who apparently do not care to tell us about what is happening in their sectors?" Voronov, who was present, has recounted that Shapashnikov, not in the least put out, replied that he had reprimanded over the telephone both defaulting chiefs of staff, and, said Voronov, by the expression on his face and the tone of his voice, implied only too clearly that a verbal scolding by Shapashnikov was the highest punishment which could be meted out in the Soviet Union. Stalin reflected on this in silence, then said with a pained and gloomy smile, "For a military man such a reprimand is no punishment. The newest party worker gets those every day." From about the end of July 1941 the bombing raids on the capital began to disrupt the rhythm and routine of the work of government, and so it was decided to take part of the Belorussia underground railway station into use as a general headquarters. But this was not a success and the command center was moved once again to the Kirovskaya metro station in Kirov Street. This measure was, however, only a temporary one, and as soon as was practicable the offices were returned to the Kremlin and the General Staff buildings. Stalin's influence on military operations in these early days can probably be likened to that of the German dictator in the closing phases of the Second World War. In particular, Stalin's insistence on a rigid defense and on the holding of ground was almost disastrous. Yet Stalin already showed much common sense. He was energetic and down-to-earth and particularly well informed on the day-to-day state of the battle. His high command was well organized and possessed many able officers. Stalin's word was law, and his iron grip and brutal determination provided the driving force which kept the Soviet Union in the war. In most respects, Stalin's control over the Soviet armed forces followed the normal communist pattern, being based on that exercised by Lenin and by the revolutionary committees over the Red Army levies in the Civil War. On the outbreak of the Russo-German War, Stalin had displaced his own personal military and civilian political representatives to the armies. The military representatives were of high rank and were well known to the dictator and included Voroshilov, Kulik, and Shapashnikov. Their attachments were usually of only a temporary nature, and they were moved from one crisis area to another. The civilian political representatives were usually deployed for the duration of the war and included members of the Politburo and Central Committee, Khrushchev, Zhdanov, and Bulganin among them, and they dispatched the professional military commissars as the political members in most of the front and some of the army military councils. In this capacity they had the right of direct communication to Stalin and full powers of veto over the military commander, no order of consequence being valid unless bearing their counter-signature. At front level they often overshadowed the military commander. In addition to this wartime system of personal military and political representatives with the higher formations, Stalin was well served by the normal armed forces political control structure, headed by the powerful Miklas, this commissar organization existing throughout all levels of command in the Red Army and Fleet, in all headquarters, staff branches, formations, and units. The commissar was a soldier, as opposed to the political member of the military council, who could be a Stalin-appointed civilian. The commissar's activities were devoted to the political education, awareness, and reliability of officers and men of his formation or unit, but he often had experience or knowledge of command and undertook additional duties such as administration and welfare. The commissar was usually among the most knowledgeable officers of the Red Army, and he reported regularly and privately on the political reliability of commanders through his own staff channels. Anything of real importance found its way to Stalin's ears through Miklas, the commander-in-chief. This channel of information was quite separate from that of the NKVD secret police within the Red Army, whose intelligence went to Stalin by way of Beria. The whole of the command control and information system was in this way based on as many as 5 separate and totally independent. The war is virtually one. Channels all reporting on day-to-day activities as well as on personal ideas, 2 military, 1 political through the military councils, not below army, 1 commissar, and 1 NKVD. Stalin was the terminal of each channel. It was for this reason that the dictator was so much better informed of current developments than his military commanders in the field. Military commissars, too, originally had powers of veto over the orders of the commanders to whom they were accredited, but shortly before the war this power had been removed, the commissar being made subordinate to the military commander. The commissar's powers were restored once more to that of equality with the commander following the great defeats in the summer of 1941. The Red Air Force did not exist as a separate armed service but formed part of the Red Army, the aviator wearing khaki army uniform with light blue arm of service gorget patches. Fighter and bomber regiments and divisions formed part of the Red Army order of battle in very much the same fashion as artillery formations and, with the exception of the small long-range Air Force, were used only in tactical support of ground operations. The Soviet Navy, although a separate arm of the service, was considered to be of very minor importance compared with that of the Red Army, for Stalin, like Hitler, had a continental cast of mind. Although the Navy was large in numbers of war vessels, it was in fact poorly trained and inadequately equipped. Most of the warships were obsolete. Opposed only by the lightest of German naval forces in the Baltic and the Black Sea, it nevertheless soon lost control of those waters to the Luftwaffe, and, had it not been for the intervention of the British Royal Navy in northern waters, would have lost the sea war in the Arctic Circle. But it is very doubtful whether Stalin had any interest in the naval war or in the Red Fleet, other than using it as a reserve of bayonets to provide marine infantry brigades for the land fighting. History was soon to show that the Red Army had a number of higher commanders and staff officers of talent, yet the Soviet command and field organization in 1941 was unable to meet the stresses of total war. Red Army officers were already part of the privileged elite in Soviet society, their pay having been increased by as much as 2 to 400% over the 5 years from 1934 to 1939. The greatest differential being that of the senior field and general officers. 25 Their effectiveness and training had not improved in the same ratio, however. Standards were uneven. The troops were often undisciplined and poorly trained and, because of the many nationalities which made up the Soviet Union, numbers were illiterate in the Russian language. Soviet military theory and doctrine had originally been based on that of Germany, but from 1933 onwards, when Hitler had cut all military liaison between the Reichswehr and the Red Army, the Soviet High Command had been obliged, as far as it was able, to develop its own ideas. It had relied to some extent on the pattern of the French Army, this being reflected in the organization of the Red Army tank forces which were allocated piecemeal to infantry and cavalry divisions. No large Soviet tank formations existed in 1940 equivalent to the German Panzer Group or Panzer Corps. The German victory in France caused the Soviet High Command speedily to revert from the French to the German model, and tank corps were rapidly thrown together, these being almost exact replicas of Panzer Corps, consisting of 2 tank divisions and 1 motorized division. The German invasion caught the Soviet tank forces still unprepared, with the new formations untrained and often incompletely equipped, and the great losses in tanks suffered during the summer of 1941 forced the abandonment of the use of any tank formation above that of a tank brigade, with the strength of about 60 tanks. Because of the poor state of field training, Soviet commanders at this time were unable to handle an armored formation of a larger size. During that summer, too, the Soviet Corps organization, that between the level of division and army, was done away with in order to save on overheads, particularly trained commanders and staff. Until the Corps was reintroduced in 1943, an army, which was often reduced to the size of 3 or 4 divisions, became in fact the equivalent of a German corps. A similar reorganization took place in the Red Air Force, where the standard regiment was reduced from 60 to 30 aircraft. Meanwhile, at the end of July and the beginning of August, von Bock's Army Group Center was at Smolensk, apparently poised to make the final march on Moscow. Because the left flank of Timoshenko's West Front had been in the air and open to Guderian's probings in the south during the rapid German approach to the Dnieper, a new central front, consisting of only 2 armies, had been formed under F.I. Kuznetsov, this providing the link between Timoshenko and Budany. Kuznetsov had been the unsuccessful commander in the Baltic states. He was no more successful here, for Guderian swept the central front away. In August the remnants were formed into a new Bryansk front under Eremenko, having the same task as that of the disbanded Central Front, of preventing the German invader from outflanking Timoshenko from the south and advancing northeast on Moscow. On July 28 Zhukov, immediately before he had been relieved from his appointment as Chief of General Staff, was called to Stalin's office. Miklas, the Commissar-in-Chief and the head of the main political administration, being present. The likely German intentions were discussed, Zhukov insisting, so he has subsequently said, that von Bock would not continue his offensive towards Moscow because he had suffered so many casualties. For this reason, said Zhukov, the German High Command would be obliged to turn south to the Ukraine. It is doubtful whether Zhukov did in fact give his opinion at that time, since his view fits too neatly into the later Soviet version of the battle. But if this was Zhukov's opinion, it was hardly based on the facts of the situation, for the German casualty figures on July 16 for the whole of the Eastern Theater totaled only 102,000, just over 3% of the total field strength, and even by 2 August Army Group Center losses for all reasons, including sickness, had only risen to 74,000.27. Hitler's decision to send Guderian to the south and Hoth to the north had of course been taken 6 months before the outbreak of war. At the time when Zhukov says that he gave this opinion to Stalin, hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops had been encircled between Minsk and Smolensk and were in the process of being destroyed. During those fateful July days, the Red Army in western Russia was in fact near disintegration. As an example, Major General Gorbatov, the deputy commander of a rifle corps forming part of Lieutenant General Konyev's army, himself recently released from the concentration camp, has described how his troops arrived by train from the Ukraine to stem the German advance towards Moscow. A fresh formation, which had never been in action before, it was dug in hurriedly as it arrived, but no sooner had a few scattered shells fallen in the forward defended localities than the leading infantry regiment deserted its positions and, officers and commissars among them, streamed off the field en masse. Rigorous measures were taken by Timoshenko to restore discipline, including the setting up of catchment areas on the roads to the rear where the retreating, and often leaderless and weaponless, troops were reformed, re-equipped, and sent back into the battle. There, the retreating officers and commissars were singled out for trial by flying courts-martial and in many cases shot on the spot. Yet the great retreats continued. Nor did a number of the commissars, on whom the morale and steadfastness of the troops much depended, distinguish themselves at this time, and it went badly with many a soldier found retreating without papers, tunic, or other means of identity, since he came under suspicion of being a commissar who had rid himself of the telltale stitched-on sleeve badge in case he should be taken prisoner. For the commissars well knew of Hitler's order requiring their execution without trial. Since the old reserve front had been incorporated into the West Front, Stalin had, on July 14, authorized the formation of a new reserve front under the temporary command of Lieutenant General I.A. Bogdanov, and 2 days later a new Moscow front was brought into being under Lieutenant General Artemev, the commander of Moscow Military District. In spite of what Zhukov has subsequently said, there seems little doubt that, at the time, the Soviet High Command expected von Bock to resume his attack eastward and it endeavored to hold at all costs the area immediately east of Smolensk, together with the two cornerstones, Veliki Luki to the north and Gomel to the south. As soon as it had become obvious that the German panzer troops had been temporarily taken into reserve, Timoshenko attempted to regain some initiative and pressed his own infantry formations forward into limited counterattacks well supported by artillery and the newly introduced Katyusha multiple rockets. A static battle of attrition did not suit von Bock, for German successes since 1939 had been based on the correlation between fire and movement, the predominant factor, in which the Germans excelled, being movement. A war of movement involved few casualties and little ammunition, whereas the static battles of attrition always resulted in comparatively heavy losses of men and a great expenditure of the artillery and mortar ammunition needed to provide counter-bombardment and defensive fire. Von Bock had little ammunition available. The Army Group Center supply channel relied on the very limited third-line motor transport resources of the OKH, since the Soviet railways could not be used until the rail track had been converted from the broad Russian to the standard Central European gauge. The lack of artillery ammunition was to cause difficulties for the German defenders, but this was not the only complaint which von Bock raised against the German High Command. In midsummer 1941 the German troops had won their battles by concentrating their forces about the decisive points, so achieving the necessary local numerical superiority over a disorganized enemy, who was desperately trying to hold ground. In August 1941 the Army Group commanders were finding that the vastness of the Russian hinterland and the fact that its funnel shape resulted in the broadening of frontages the further east one marched, were giving rise to problems, since the Führer, requiring the whole area to be cleared of the enemy, insisted that advancing formations should keep in close touch with their flanking neighbors. There were not enough troops to go round, and in consequence formations became too widely dispersed, reserves could not be accumulated nor the momentum of the advance maintained. Moreover, because of the vagaries of the Führer's strategy, von Bock had lost 4 of his 5 Panzer Corps to Leningrad and the Ukraine, and 3 more infantry corps of von Weichsel's II Army had been detached from the area south of Smolensk to accompany Guderian in his southward march toward Kiev. Because of the wide frontages and the lack of troops, von Bock's resistance to the concentrated Soviet counterattacks about Smolensk and Elna during late August and the beginning of September was somewhat weakened. He was not one to suffer quietly the removal of his formations, and he did not fail to send a long string of complaints to the OKH both about what he called his own weakness and the growing enemy strength. In order to save casualties, it eventually became necessary to evacuate the small Elna salient. Yet, in truth, von Bock may have exaggerated and dramatized his difficulties, for elsewhere his troops held strongly enough. There was indeed some general surprise among German officers and men that the order had not been given to continue the march on Moscow, and a few of the infantry divisions had actually been detailed to provide working parties to assist in getting in the local harvest. Timoshenko's counterattacks were later to be described as the Battle of Smolensk, which, according to the Soviet official history, caused Hitler to alter his original plan and call off the attack against Moscow, Zhukov even going so far as to say that according to the German generals the Hitlerite forces lost 250,000 men in the battle. Yet, in dismissing this view as a flight of fancy, it must be acknowledged that Timoshenko had so far restored the shattered morale of West Front that it was able to undertake the first offensive operations yet carried out against Army Group Center, even if these had only limited objectives. There is no doubt, too, that the attacks were pushed home with vigor. West Front was, however, in no condition to withstand a German thrust had one been intended, as the events of the next month were to show, for in a space of 3 days it was to fall apart under the German hammer blows, and within a further week was to yield 600,000 prisoners. Nearly 2 years were to elapse before Red Army ground formations could hold their own against German troops, and 3 years before the Red Air Force began to clear the skies of the Luftwaffe.